Construction and Veterans Affairs Appropriations Subcommittee to order. This morning, we are holding a hearing on the President's 2019 National Emergency Declaration circumventing Congress to build a border wall and its effect on military construction and readiness. We're here today because the President has decided that his political agenda is apparently more important than our military readiness. The President has decided to take $3.6 billion from military construction projects that the military asked for, said they needed, and that support the military and their families, to build his wall without congressional approval, projects which he says didn't sound too important to me, referring to himself. What we are witnessing is a president who poses a direct threat to both our military families and America's national security. First, there is no border emergency. That is a fabrication. The administration's own statistics show that crossings and apprehensions are at historic lows. Furthermore, 90% of all drugs entering the country come through legal points of entry. Contrary to statements made by the President, drug traffickers are not walking loads of narcotics through the desert and into the U.S. on foot. This declaration undermines U.S. national security and the needs of our men and women in uniform, as well as its credibility. And in fact, there was the admiral responsible for the Northern Command said as much in testimony this week, declaring that there is not an emergency on our southern border. The fact is the President shut down the government over funding for this wall. Then Congress reopened the government and then negotiated the border wall issue, which was rejected by a bipartisan, bicameral committee who chose not to include the $5.7 billion for this boondoggle. So in response to losing, the President has chosen to use an emergency construction authority, which has been used only 18 times since September 2001. And in those cases, only under rare and highly scrutinized circumstances has this authority been used for projects in the United States, notably for security measures in December 2001 at military installations storing sensitive materials or weapons. The remaining uses of the authority have been for facilities in Afghanistan, Iraq, Djibouti, and a handful of other locations in the U.S. Central Command's area of operations because we were at war. Using Section 2808 of Title 10 of the U.S. Code like this, simply put, is stealing. Stealing funds requested by DOD and approved by Congress and taken away from military needs, all to build his wall. The President's emergency declaration is exclusively so he can bypass Congress and not to address a bona fide emergency. The administration is attempting to misuse the flexibility provided by Congress to fund construction projects that directly support the use of our armed forces in an emergency or a declared war. The President's plan is not to make us safer. It is, in fact, an attempt to fulfill his campaign promise to build an unnecessary wall that he said Mexico would pay for. And there will be real consequences for military readiness if we continue down this road. Just last year, DOD senior leaders testified before Congress about a backlog of $116 billion of unfunded facility requirements and that 32% of their facilities were in poor or failing condition. And I have had an opportunity to tour some of these facilities where they repeated those statistics. Let me repeat that. 32% of DOD facilities are in poor or failing condition, according to DOD. Diverting appropriated funds that were provided to specific construction projects will affect military training, readiness, and quality of life for troops and their families. It proves that petty politics are being put ahead of the readiness and well-being of our troops and their families. This is just the latest political gimmick to use the military, and this time in support of the President's misguided approach to our immigration policies. Invoking emergency military construction authority comes after he has previously unnecessarily deployed active duty troops and equipment to the southern border. So what's next? Because remember, this is only a portion of an estimated $30 billion that the President ultimately wants to spend on the wall. Does the administration plan to steal military construction funding every year going forward? It is clear that there is no national emergency, only a manufactured crisis. And there has been no attempt to explain how the wall has anything to do with supporting U.S. military needs as the law intends. From the beginning, President Trump's obsession over a border wall has been based on misguided anti-immigrant fervor, not U.S. national security. I oppose this dangerous gimmick. A majority of this House opposes this gimmick, and the American people are utterly opposed to this gimmick. Putting our military families and our troops in this situation is shameful, and President Trump should be ashamed of himself for attempting a win-at-all-costs approach to getting his way. which apparently, from the hearing I just came from, is his MO on just about everything. And with that being said, I'd like to recognize my ranking member, Judge Carter, for his opening remarks. Mr. Carter?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate being recognized. And thank you for holding this hearing. Thank you to all the witnesses that are appearing before the subcommittee to consider the Defense Department's implementation of the President's National Emergency Declaration. I share the President's commitment to securing the border. I've authored past DHS funding bills and proudly voted for the fiscal year 2019 Homeland Security Bill, which, among many other important things, provided funding for the new barriers and personnel. I support my ranking member, Ms. Granger, and agree that additional funding is needed to address the humanitarian and security crisis on our southern border. Yet, while I stand with the President on this important national security issue, I will not do so at the expense of the soldiers and families of Fort Hood. I look forward to learning more about the procedures and processes that the administration will use in determining exactly how the border wall will be funded under a national emergency declaration. We have to solve the crisis at the southern border, but not at the expense of those who have bravely served. But I do believe there is a crisis. It's reported that 50,000 illegal crossings took place in January. Anticipated 75,000 will cross in February, and anticipated that 100,000 will cross in March. And to me, that's a crisis. I yield back.
Thank you, Judge Carter. Now I'd like to represent Ranking Member Granger for her opening remarks.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the chairwoman and the ranking member of the Military Construction Subcommittee for holding this hearing today on the President's Border Emergency Declaration. Earlier this month, I had the opportunity to travel to the southern border to see firsthand the situation we face. I agree with the President that we have a crisis at the border that must be addressed, both for the sake of the American people and for those seeking entry. I'm proud of the work my colleagues and I did to reach a bipartisan compromise on Homeland Security that included funding for a significant section of the border barrier. While this was a good down payment, significant additional funding is still needed to secure our border and to address the humanitarian and security crisis we face. The law allows the President to dedicate military construction funds to this crisis if he makes an emergency declaration, which he has now. Although we have different opinions about the President's decision, I believe we have the ability and the responsibility to find ways to work together going forward. As ranking member of this committee, I'll work with the White House and my colleagues to ensure that any funds that are reallocated are done so in a way that does not impact our military readiness. I also expect the department will continue to be transparent and provide information to us as plans are developed to implement the President's plan to secure our border. All of the members of Congress and the witnesses here today have a vested interest in a strong national defense and care deeply about our country's future. In order to achieve this, I believe we must also have a secure border. I hope in this hearing today we can continue to have many conversations we've had over the years and work cooperatively to keep our nation secure. I know that my friend Mrs. Lowy and I want to see the spirit of bipartisanship that allowed us to reach a compromise with our Senate colleagues 2 weeks ago to continue during our time as chair and ranking member. I look forward to working with everyone on the subcommittee and the witnesses before us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member Granger, and I think we all concur in your very gracious remarks. We have two panels this morning, one representing the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the other with the installation assistant secretaries. This morning we have the Honorable Robert McMahon, H. McMahon, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Sustainment, and Mr. Robert Salas, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense Integration and Defense Support of Civil Authorities, who is here in a support role only. Secretary McMahon, your full written testimony will be included in the record, please summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. You're recognized.
Thank you, Chairwoman Westerman Schultz, Judge Carter, Ranking Member Granger, distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the Department of Defense's support to the Department of Homeland Security's U.S. Customs and Border Protection mission to secure the southern border of the United States. As I begin, I want to assure you that no currently authorized military construction projects will be canceled to fund military construction projects supporting use of the armed forces at the southern border. Further, while some current military construction projects may be deferred, the fiscal year 2020 President's budget request will include a request for funds to replenish funding for these projects. On February 15, 2019, the President declared that a national emergency requiring use of the armed forces exists along the southern border and invoked Title 10, United States Code, Section 2808. Section 2808 authorizes the Acting Secretary of Defense to use unobligated military construction funds for military construction projects that support the use of the armed forces in connection with the national emergency. This authority can only be used on federal land under the jurisdiction of a military department. As the White House indicated as late as last evening, the funding sources that the President made available for barrier construction, quote, will be used sequentially and as needed, with the $1.375 billion from appropriated funds used first, then the $3.1 billion from other statutory authorities, and then the $3.6 billion from military construction, unquote. At this time, the Acting Secretary has not decided whether use of Section 2808 authorities is necessary. To inform his decision, the Acting Secretary has requested from the Department of Homeland Security a list of proposed border barrier construction projects prioritized in order of effectiveness that could improve the effectiveness and efficiency of DoD personnel supporting the border mission. DoD is currently awaiting DHS's response to that request. In support of the Acting Secretary's consideration of Section 2808, DoD is conducting a deliberate process to identify military construction projects that could be used as funding sources. If the Acting Secretary determines that use of Section 2808 authorities is necessary, we will provide you the information on affected projects as soon as it is available. In order to protect military readiness, the projects that are most likely to be temporarily delayed include those that pose no or minimal operational readiness risks if deferred. Secondly, projects that were already scheduled to be awarded in the last 6 months of the fiscal year. And third, recapitalization projects of existing facilities that can be temporarily deferred for a period of months. Again, let me absolutely be clear. No currently authorized military construction projects will be canceled to fund projects under Section 2808, nor is the Department considering any family housing projects as funding sources for Section 2808. Further, the fiscal year 2020 budget will include a request for funds that could be used to carry out the already authorized projects. This process is ongoing, and I stand ready to execute the necessary actions once a decision has been made. In carrying out this mission, I will continually assess the DoD capabilities and resources necessary to meet these mission requirements while mitigating impacts of military readiness and considering ongoing and future operational commitments. I look forward to your questions. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary McMahon. I need to ask you to clarify what you've said twice during your opening statement. You used the term currently authorized projects. All of our unobligated projects are authorized. So that would mean that what you're saying is none of the unobligated projects all of which are authorized, requested by DOD and adopted by Congress, would be off limits based on the way you've characterized your intentions. So what do you mean?
Congresswoman, what I stated was that for all of the projects that have currently been appropriated and authorized, none of those projects will be canceled. Some may be deferred, and if in fact they are deferred, those projects will be, funds for those will be included in the President's budget for 2020. So the intent is there was an implication that there would be cancellation of projects. No projects would be canceled under this process. Okay,
well, I understand that we're dealing in verbal gymnastics here, but the way that would occur in practice is that if you haven't, like I said, all of these projects are authorized. They have yet to have their funding obligated, meaning spending has not yet begun. It's about $21 billion in eligible projects. You are suggesting that $3.6 billion of that is what you would be targeting, and I have questions about that in a moment. However, if you're suggesting that none of them will be canceled, but perhaps deferred, and then backfilled, which is what you're saying, by coming back to Congress in FY20 and asking for those projects to be replaced, essentially what you're doing is circumventing Congress, which to get funding for the wall, which you could not get during the conference process, and instead coming back and trying to get us to replace that funding during the FY20 appropriations cycle. Isn't that right?
Congresswoman, the President has identified a national emergency.
No, excuse me, Secretary McMahon. I'm asking you a direct question. I already laid out that we have a significant disagreement over whether there's a national emergency, including that you have a significant disagreement with General Terrence O'Shaughnessy, who is the NORTHCOM commander, who also publicly testified, and I'd like unanimous consent to enter this article into the record with the general's comments, who also testified that there's not a crisis on the southern border. What I'm asking you is that you testified just now that no currently authorized projects would be touched, essentially, canceled, to divert funds for the border wall. Instead,
yes, ma'am, that's correct. That's what I testified.
And instead you say, but perhaps they might be deferred. And then backfilled, basically, what you're saying is that if you come back to Congress in FY20 and ask for that funding to be replaced, essentially what you're doing is you're trying to relitigate a battle that you already lost during the conference process, where a bicameral, bipartisan agreement was reached that the President signed. And so aren't you just backdooring, trying to get the funding for the wall by deferring the expenditures of those projects, spending that money on the wall, and then asking for the money to be replaced later when you couldn't get that done during the conference process?
Congresswoman, what we're attempting to do is execute the guidance that we've received from the Commander-in-Chief.
No, I'm asking you, in practicality, in practical application, isn't that what you are doing? Isn't that the result?
Congressman, what I think we're doing is executing the President as Commander-in-Chief's direction to us to be able to fund a portion of the border wall in fiscal year 19.
Okay, Mr. Secretary, you're fooling no one, really. I mean, I'm not sure what kind of chumps you think my colleagues and I are, but canceling, deferring, coming back in FY20 to replace, all leads to the same thing. You are taking money from vital projects that the military previously said were essential and spending that money on a wall and then asking for the money to be backfilled later in the next fiscal year when we already had that debate and the President's proposal was rejected and we had a bicameral bipartisan agreement. So that there's nothing more clear than that. I understand that that's the President's direction, but his direction is as I've described. I am over time, and with that, I yield and recognize Judge Carter.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I just got a copy of this discussion that the chairwoman was talking about, what General Terrence O'Shaughnessy said as it is not a military threat on the southern border. He goes on to say, the threats to our nation from the southern border are not military in nature, but are significant and deadly. The flow of illegal narcotics into the United States continues to inflict a heavy toll on our citizens, as clearly demonstrated by the 72,000 Americans who were killed by drug overdose in 2017. He goes on to say a secure border does not reduce threats to the homeland. A secure border does reduce threats to the homeland. I do see that any barrier in place to secure our nation does have some ramifications to our ability to defend against a military threat as well. Right now, there's not a specific military force from the South that are trying to take an action against us. I just wanted to point that out to clarify the conversation. Now, I understand the department may not adhere to the cooperative traditions of the administration and Congress, which have been developed over the past 7 decades. These traditions provided the administration with flexibility in the use of appropriated funds, ensuring congressional oversight. Are you aware of a new precedent being set? And does the department realize it could lose some or a lot of flexibility in spending appropriated funds?
Judge, I was not in the room when those conversations were taking place. What I do know is that the president has identified it as a national security issue and has declared a national emergency, and what he has asked us to do is move forward with execution of that. I would defer that larger question to the White House and to the NSC as to whether or not that was part of the conversation.
Okay, that's fair enough. Fiscal year 2019 Homeland Security bill provided for nearly $1.4 billion in border security projects. It will take at least 2 years to design and build them, and this may be a Homeland Security question. Why does the department need to take military construction funds now for projects that may not be ready for many years? Does the department intend to set aside funds for projects in future fiscal years?
Judge, as you're aware, the military construction dollars that we receive are 5-year funds. As you know, that many of our projects are funded over multiple years, and what this is, in fact, is an effort to continue to accelerate the rate at which the wall or the barrier is currently being built. And what we are doing is continuing to leverage construction that started in prior years as we continue to move forward.
The department has indicated it will replenish the military construction funds used for border projects in fiscal year 2019 in the fiscal year 2020 budget. Do you have a plan to provide a list of projects in the 2020 budget request, and how would quote replenish fund work?
Judge, to your first question, as soon as the department, first of all, has identified what the available projects are, currently we've provided you some gross numbers in terms of unobligated military construction funds at this point in time. We will provide you a by project, by state listing of what those unobligated projects are. We hope to do that very soon. And if the Acting Secretary of Defense, in conjunction with advice from the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, identifies that there are appropriate projects that would fall under the 2808 authorities, if that's it, in fact, there is a requirement that is identified through that process, and certain projects are identified, that information will be made available to the Congress.
And I'm very proud of the fact that you're not going to affect readiness in any form or fashion. that
Judge,
what I
when you
understand?
look at the criteria that I laid out in my earlier statement, the intent is to do exactly that, is to minimize the impact of any military construction funds that would be used, and certainly not affect readiness by that. Again, there are no cancellations. This is simply a deferral of capability.
I'm over my time, but I look forward to getting that list when it's prepared. And thank you for your testimony.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Judge Carter. Ms. Pingree?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you very much, Mr. Secretary, for being here with us today. Just to drill down a little bit on the decisions that are going to be made here. In your testimony, you state that DoD is conducting a deliberate process to identify MILCON projects that could be used as funding sources with 4 broad categories. So I have a couple of questions, and I'll just put them all out there and let you answer. Has OSD developed criteria for determining whether a project is deferrable? If so, can you share that criteria with the subcommittee? If not, is it left to each service to select which projects they consider acceptable to delay? How are you accounting for the incremental costs, including operational readiness, which I know was already brought up, of deferred construction? For example, there are 4 approved but not yet awarded projects at Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, which I represent. One of those is a critical component of the dry dock modernization plan that would allow all of its dry docks on the Virginia-class submarine. If the FY19 project is deferred, the follow-on projects move to the right, and the Navy will have to juggle availability and postpone maintenance. So how do you account for that? And lastly, how will you use your office to ensure that the selection of projects is not influenced by the politics by, say, choosing projects in the districts of members who voted yesterday for the resolution to terminate the emergency declaration? We would hate to see politics intervene here in our military readiness and our ability to retrofit submarines.
Congresswoman, if I could start with the last question first. Having served 34 years in uniform and now back for 2 years, the pride that we take in as much as possible being apolitical in the decisions that we do and looking out for our soldiers or sailors or airmen Marines, I am aware of no senior leader in the building, military or civilian, that would ever put at risk taking care of those individuals and our capability to fight for simply the role of politics. I've never seen it in the time that I've been, and this is my 4th time in the building, and I would never expect to see it, and I don't think it would be tolerated by anyone there. If I sound emotional on that issue, I am. We're tremendously proud of the approach that we take to take care of those who serve our nation.
Thank you.
Congresswoman, with regards to your other questions, what I would tell you with regards, first of all, to project deferral, the criteria that I spelled out specifically goes to the fact that, first of all, we said that we want to ensure that we pose no or minimal impact on operations. And in doing so, we don't want to impact readiness by the projects that we select. And so that would be the key criteria. And as we walk through the other criteria, is every project that we present to the Congress we believe is important, or we wouldn't have asked for it. What there is within that is some relative importance and priority within that, and what we want to do is understand for those that still have unobligated dollars is that we're minimizing the overall impact as we grant or grade each and every one of those. With regards to your question on service choice, the services absolutely have the best idea of what that looks like. And so we will defer to the secretaries and their assistant secretaries to make the assessment of what that looks like in terms of what are the best projects, as well as their comptrollers to understand what that list of and least impacting projects are as we defer them for some short period of time. And then to recognize there may be some incremental cost. We've not assessed that. I'd be happy to take that question for the record and come back to you and answer that in more detail.
Thank you for those answers, and I appreciate your attempt to be thoughtful in the process. And I also want you to know we value your service to the country and serving in the position that you do, and I really do appreciate your very thoughtful answer about making sure that politics stays out of this. I'm sorry to say that many of us are more concerned about the Commander-in-Chief's inability to leave politics out of this, but I greatly respect your answer and the work that you do, so thank you for that.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Ms. Pingree. Ms. Granger?
Thank you for being here. I have a question and then I have a request. On the question, do you intend to transfer any military construction funds into the Counter-Drug Authority because these authorities are more flexible? And what other DOD sources have funds readily available that can be transferred into the counter-drug account?
Sorry. I'll be glad to do that. As you're familiar, the Counter-Drug Authority, the department allows us to erect fences, lighting, and roads under that authority. Currently, we do have a request from DHS to provide support to them. There's certain circumstances that have to be met in order to do this. We've received the request. It's like the land where the barriers or fencing would go has to be declared a drug smuggling area, which in the request it has been. I'll get to the question about the money. We are looking at funding that could potentially be reprogrammed into 284, into the counter-narcotics, but no decisions on that funding, specific funding, that would be moved into 284 has been addressed at this point.
Thank you. And as to the request, I would ask you, as soon as you identify the lower priority military construction projects that will be delayed into future years, would you please provide that information to this committee?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Granger. Mr. Bishop is going to go out of order because he has a committee that he has to chair at 3 o'clock, and also to just let the members know they've just called votes. We will stand in recess after Mr. Bishop's questions, and then if everyone just come straight back after this vote series.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman, and I thank my colleagues for allowing me to go out of turn. Let me welcome Secretary McMahon and Secretary Celestis. It's good to see you again, Mr. Secretary, after your great stint leading Robbins Air Force Base down near Middle Georgia. So we appreciate you very much. I understand that in your capacity you have to answer to the Commander-in-Chief. And I understand that the President declared an emergency. But it's a considered judgment of a lot of people, particularly people who have a defense background and are familiar with the situation, that this is an emergency over a crisis that does not exist. A bipartisan group of 60 national security officials, including former secretaries of state, defense secretaries, CIA directors, and ambassadors to the United Nations, issued a statement declaring that there is no factual basis for justifying the President's emergency declaration. Furthermore, it appears that instead of protecting our national security, that the President's declaration actually steals billions of dollars from high-priority military construction projects that ensure that our troops have the essential training, readiness, and quality of life to keep America safe. And ultimately, that undermines our national security. Now, I know right now in the state of Georgia, MILCOM projects are at risk due to unobligated funds of Fort Gordon's Cyber Instructional Facility Network, that's $99 million. A Naval Reserve Training Center at Fort Benning, almost $14 million, which is pretty close to $113 million of projects taken away from what you and your colleagues fought for in testimonies before this committee, claiming that readiness was a top priority. I just want to understand how you will justify it in terms of morale for the troops who have seen these hard-fought projects come up to be funded, how you will justify the readiness, and how you, and I know it's a above your pay grade can condone the violation of the Constitution, the separation of powers of Article 1, that the Constitution that you swore to uphold and defend against all enemies, foreign and domestic. How can you justify that?
Congressman, as always, it's great to see a fellow Middle Georgian, and thank you for the support that you've given over the many years that I served in the relationship and the support you gave to Robbins. I know they continue to appreciate that. Congressman, as was pointed out earlier, there is a tremendous debate on this issue. I acknowledge that. I acknowledge also that the President has declared a national emergency, and what he has asked me to do through the Acting Secretary of Defense is to ensure that we are as prepared as possible to execute in the direction that we are going in terms of possibly using Section 2808. We're taking that approach. I think if I could speak for the three assistant secretaries who will follow on the next panel, all will tell you that they have fought and will continue to fight for the programs that they believe in. We believe we have protected that requirement because of the fact that we are simply deferring for a short period of time until we get to 2020. The President's budget request to be able to share the information before the budget has been actually released is important enough, I think, to the administration to make sure that you know that we have a plan.
Excuse me for a moment, Mr. Secretary, but the President's budget request is not law. The FY19 budget is law. The President's budget request has not and is not assured to be appropriated. FY19 budget has been appropriated, and it is law.
Congressman, you are correct, and we look forward to advocating for what it is that we would push forward in the 20 appropriations to this committee.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bishop. At this point, the committee will stand in recess, and we will reconvene immediately following votes. I would ask all members to come directly back to this hearing room so we can continue. We will do one round of questions with these witnesses, and then we'll move to the second panel. This committee stands in recess.
Everybody else for our diversion over to the floor. Mr. Hurd, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, sir. Gentlemen, thank you all for being here. And if you don't mind, I want to get a little parochial, and I'm sure y'all are prepared for this. And Secretary, in your remarks, opening remarks, you talked about the potential impact on projects that are unobligated. And so I have a series of specific questions. For example, Laughlin Air Force Base, depending on what year it is, and Del Rio, Texas, produces more pilots. It produces number 1 and number 2 number of pilots in the country. If it rained more than an inch, the flight line got flooded. I know y'all have seen the pictures. It looked like a bathtub, and the planes moving around. Because of the support of this committee, we were able to address that in 3 phases. First phase is ongoing, but the second phase of this drainage project that will prevent the flight line of one of our nation's premier pilot training facilities from being flooded. The second phase is unobligated. So is this the type of project that could potentially be impacted by 2808?
Congressman, I don't want to speculate because I want to work with the services on specifically, as we defined earlier, the specific criteria that we laid out. In some cases, there are projects that are absolutely essential. In some cases, there are projects that could be delayed a month or 2. And without getting to specifics, I'd have to talk to the service on that specific project.
That's a good copy. So that's neither a yes nor a no as of right now.
That's correct, sir. And as I said earlier in my statement, we are not that far along yet because the acting secretary is yet to identify whether or not there are any examples of projects that we would have to fund from 2808 authorities.
That's a good copy. So also Joint Base San Antonio has one of the oldest military air traffic control towers in the country at Kelly Airfield. The first military flight happened in my hometown of San Antonio. The air conditioning system is failing, and as you know, in the great state of Texas, especially South Texas in the summer, it can be over 110 degrees multiple days in a year. Again, this is one of the projects that has unobligated funds. And based on your previous answer, I'm assuming this is a project that may or may not be impacted by 2808. Is that correct interpretation?
Congressman, that is correct. That's the analysis that we will go through here shortly.
And you also talked about how much, so not all of the FY 2019 funds have been obligated. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
So there's $24 million in authorized construction projects for this fiscal year at Fort Bliss in El Paso, Texas, one of the largest Army facilities I think the largest Army facility in the United States. And do we know if any of those $24 million in authorized construction projects were actually obligated?
Congressman, I'd have to take that question for the record. I don't have that in front of me.
I appreciate that. And then the second question that I would ask you to take for the record is, if there is some of those $24 million in authorized construction projects at Fort Bliss are unobligated, could they pretend, I'm assuming based on your answer to your previous two questions, that they could or could not be impacted by the emergency declaration of 2808?
Congressman, I can't answer that question, and that's part of the analysis process that we're still going through, and it would depend upon what the Secretary of the Army, in conjunction with his staff, determined in terms of priorities, if any of their dollars were to be used, any of their military construction dollars were to be used, assuming the acting secretary had said we were going to use 2808 authority.
That's a good copy. And one, I can't even imagine what it's like to manage 28 million acres, 500 installations, 500,000 buildings, and more than $1 trillion of structures. But it's because of folks like you. We have the greatest fighting force in the world, and I know the difficult situation that you're in, but we appreciate your questions today. Chairman, I yield back.
Congressman.
Thank you, Mr. Hurd. Chair recognizes the full committee chair, Ms. Lowy, for 5 minutes.
Well, I thank you to my friend, Mr. Case. Excuse me if I don't have a voice today. I want to thank Chairwoman Wasserman Schultz and Ranking Member Carter for holding this hearing, and welcome Assistant Secretary McMahon and Deputy Assistant Secretary Solisas. I'm very sorry for missing your testimony, but I want to make it clear that in my judgment, the President's phony national emergency declaration and his decision to rob essential military construction funding provided by this committee and enacted by Congress are a direct assault on the Constitution and must not stand. My question is, funding appropriated by Congress for the specific purpose of supporting our military and their families should be used as directed, not for construction of a wall. Deputy Assistant Secretary Solisas, why is building a border wall more important than supporting our military and their families? And Assistant Secretary McMahon, this committee provided on time a substantial full-year military construction budget to the Department of Defense. Why is the vast majority of more than $11 billion in military construction still unobligated? We can hear from Deputy Assistant Secretary Solisas and Assistant Secretary Mr. McMahon in that order. Thank you.
Chairwoman Lowry, the President has determined through the declaration of a national emergency that construction is essential along the border of barrier. The Department of Defense supports the Commander-in-Chief, so that determination has been made, and we've been provided guidance and direction.
So you don't have a rationale as to why that is more important than supporting our military and families. You're just following direction from the Commander-in-Chief. I guess that's what you are told you must do. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am. That's what the Department of Defense does. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And Assistant Secretary McMahon, can you explain why is the vast majority of more than $11 billion in military construction still unobligated?
Madam Chairwoman, as you know, projects are done throughout the entire year, so the fact that there are still dollars available this year that have yet to be obligated were originally planned in some cases to have been obligated later in the year. And so this is a customary process. If you look back over the last 4 or 5 years, there is a standard where those dollars are spread throughout the year before they're executed to make sure that the planning is done fully before we begin executing dollars on the actual construction.
So I'm trying to understand, if the president wants to use these dollars to build the wall, that could take away from dollars that would be used later on in the year. Is that correct?
Ma'am, in some cases, Madam Chairwoman, in some cases, those dollars may be deferred until 2020, as I indicated.
They're less important than the wall, I guess. Someone has made that decision.
Ma'am, first of all of our projects are important.
Not as important as the wall, if they can be directed away from the
in response to the President's identification of this as a national emergency, the answer is yes, Chairwoman, that in some cases those dollars, although important, right now face a higher priority.
Okay, now let me ask you a question about West Point, which is in my home state of New York. There is more than $190 million in military readiness projects at risk because of the president's actions. Assistant Secretary McMahon, the U.S. military, the U.S. Military Academy at West Point was planning to build a new $95 million engineering center for their cadets, but the president has threatened those plans. Without this new engineering center, what will be done to ensure our young leaders are still properly educated to fight on a battlefield where complex technologies are rapidly increasing?
Madam Chairwoman, what I would tell you up front is, as I indicated earlier, no projects are being canceled. There may, in fact, be some projects that are deferred, but the reality is, at the end of the day, we're looking to the expertise of the respective services to identify once the acting secretary identifies that there is a requirement for 2808 funding and using the authorities therein, then to determine where those dollars would come from in the prioritizations that I indicated earlier. So, but those are being deferred as opposed to being canceled.
So I just want to clarify. What I think I hear you saying is that the president is all right with trading military readiness for an unnecessary border wall. Is that correct?
No, Congresswoman. As I indicated earlier, when we look at the priorities we've established for what projects that we would, in fact, utilize if required to do so, the first is that of our criteria is those that pose no or minimal operational or readiness risks. And that's been specifically identified as we look at our criteria.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Lowy. Mr. Rutherford, 5 minutes.
Secretary, we've seen reports that indicate there's as much as $21 billion in unobligated military construction dollars over the previous 5 fiscal years. First of all, is that number accurate?
Yes, Congressman. The number I think that we provided to this subcommittee was around $21.6 billion.
Okay. So of these unobligated funds, can you walk us through some of the primary reasons a contract may not have been awarded for several fiscal years?
Congressman, what I'd like to do is take that for record only because I don't want to speculate on specific cases. I'd rather give you factual cases.
Just overall. In
some cases, construction could have been delayed for a variety of different reasons. Planning could have gone poorly.
Right.
A contractor could be behind in schedule. Right. All of those are likely things that have occurred at different times.
Right. And so this is not an unusual occurrence with some of these obligated funds over a long period of time.
Part of the benefit of the Congress giving us 5-year authority on our military construction dollars is exactly to be able to absorb the type of issues that I've just discussed.
So if the delays from projects from previous fiscal years have not been considered to have a high operational risk associated with them, in that delay, why would this moment in time be any different, really?
Congressman, I'm not quite sure I understood that question.
So in the past, there are obligated funds for programs that have been delayed for whatever reason. Why would delaying some of the programs that you may be looking at now, how is that any different than what's occurred in the past over a long period of time?
Congressman, my answer to that is that's exactly why we've structured our plans the way that we have. Again, not to cancel, but simply to defer projects, and in some cases they would naturally defer anyways as we ran into those type of issues, and that's why we're relying on the services to give us the identification of which projects have the minimal impact and which ones may slip anyways because of natural happenstance.
Okay. And if I could ask, as you know, when DOD lays down these new programs that require new infrastructure, as happened with the Littoral Combat Ship program, as you know, there's 2 facilities that were prepared at Mayport, Naval Station Mayport. One's an operational support, and the other is a training facility and a support facility. Operational training facility and a support facility. Both were funded in 2019, and the operational training facility was just awarded in Phase 2. So that this Phase 2, where some funds have already been expended of the obligated funds, does that mean it will or will not be looked at on your list?
Our list, Congressman, will be, as we look at which different projects that we may defer, we're looking at specifically those that have unobligated dollars. And so if the dollars are obligated, it would not be on our list.
Okay. And the list that you finally come up with will be determined by the list of need that DHS is going to provide to you as well at some point in the future, correct?
Congressman, the list that we ultimately come up with, the DHS input will then be given to the acting secretary, who in conjunction with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs will make the determination if any of those projects are appropriate to utilize 2808 funds. And from there, we'll have an idea of what that list looks like and then how many different projects we may have to defer. Okay,
and I'm also an appropriator on Homeland Security. So when you get that list from Homeland, if you could let us have that so that we can look at that list as well.
Congressman, I'll take that for action. I don't know if there are any qualifiers on that, and I wouldn't want to promise something that I didn't have the authority to do, but I will let you know if there's an issue with doing that.
Okay. And my time expires, so Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Mr. Rutherford. I just want to point out that MILCON projects that we appropriate are not a slush fund that give the administration flexibility to spend any way they wish. We appropriate those funds for specific projects, and in fact, we are pretty diligent about not appropriating funds more than can be spent in a fiscal year. So I strongly disagree with your characterization of the administration's flexibility in spending those funds. Mr. Case.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, I want to associate myself fully with the comments of the subcommittee chair and the full chair as to the legitimacy of the emergency declaration. But going beyond that, I'm trying to understand the process that we went through to get here and the process that you propose for us to pursue from here on forward. And I am still confused about exactly how you envision this proceeding from an appropriations process. So I think, if I understand you correctly, monies were appropriated for very specific purposes. I think we'd agree on that, right? And I'm sorry.
Yes, Congressman.
Okay, and now we have an emergency declaration for which you claim the authority to divert those funds to other purposes, correct?
Congressman, that authority was given by the Congress to the President.
Okay, well, I'll get to that. And then what you are saying is that whatever funds you took from those specific purposes and use under your claimed authority for the wall or other purposes at the border, you're going to come back with a request for a further appropriation for those to be replaced, right?
That is correct, Congressman.
Okay, and you would acknowledge that that's not your decision to appropriate those further funds. That's the Congress's decision.
And that's why it would be included in the President's budget request for 2020. Yes, Congressman.
And so the entire expectation of this exercise is that Congress actually will appropriate those funds all over again.
Congressman, I won't presume what the Congress will or will not do. That is the plan that we have at this time. Yes, sir.
See, that puts us in a real dilemma from a responsible exercise of our independent appropriating power. Because if I think about the analogy, let's say my kid comes to me and says, "Hey, I have this school book that I really need for my class. Can you give me $25?" And I give my kid the school book, the $25, and then he goes out and spends it on a video game. And of course, I find out about it, and he comes to me and says, "Oh, by the way, I spent it on a video game, but now can you give me $25 for that school book?" What am I supposed to do in that situation?
Congressman, I'm not sure that I have the right to answer that question for you.
Okay. So let's talk now about the authority, 2808. Do you claim any other authority whatsoever for being able to divert these funds already appropriated by Congress for a specific purpose, and by the way, signed by the President as part of the appropriations bills? The President now says he has the authority to take that money and spend it for some other purposes, and you say the authority is 2808. I get you. Is there any other authority that you claim or that anybody claims in the administration for why you get to do that?
The authority for specifically on 2808, the other authority that we're obviously using, as we've discussed previously, was 284 on the which is outside the MILCON authorities.
Outside MILCON authorities. So those are your two claims to authority. Any other authority for this? Because I want to zero in on, I want it to be on the record what the administration or what you believe the administration considers to be its authority to do what we obviously disagree with it doing.
Just 284 is the only other authority besides 2808.
Okay. All right. What process led to this decision? Was the Department of Defense consulted in advance by the White House, by the President, by whoever? Well, obviously the President made the decision. He has the claimed authority to do it. Was the Department of Defense asked in advance? Well, what is this actually going to do to military preparedness, to military readiness, to our overall ability to, was the Department of Defense asked, hey, is it going to make any difference if we actually defer these projects for 1 to 2 years or longer? I mean, what kind of consultation occurred in advance with the Department of Defense over this raid, if I can put it that way, on funds already available and appropriated for MILCON? Was there a consultation process?
Congressman, I don't know. I was not part of that process.
Okay, so you at your level were not part of that discussion. So if it happened, it presumably happened at a higher level within DOD?
That would be my presumption.
Okay, and is there, if you can answer it or you're willing to answer it, or I'll just pose you a rhetorical question, is there a concern within Department of Defense at all over the deferral of the use of these funds for these purposes? Okay, you're assuming we're going to reappropriate those funds, and I've given you my analogy. But nonetheless, there is going to be a delay, which in some cases is pretty crucial. And I'll give you a quick example. An entire military plan to basically realign force structure in the Western Pacific, Okinawa, Guam. Now you propose to divert funds from Guam to create Guam facilities there, which are contributed to by Japan. So now Japan's all nervous about the fact that these might not happen on schedule. I believe this is the case, and if I'm not, then you can correct me here or some other time. Obviously, we have a very tense situation in Okinawa. It depends on a very careful sequencing of appropriated funds for various specific purposes. Is there a concern over the delay of that process anywhere in DOD, or is it just a deferral to the Commander-in-Chief, period?
Congressman, as I laid out earlier, there are specific criteria with which we're looking at. The first of those criteria is that poses no or minimal operational readiness impact. And to your point, that's exactly the kind of criteria and analysis that we're doing within the services, that if there is a requirement, that we would take into consideration.
Okay. I would just close with this observation, which is that when we appropriate monies, we also prioritize the expenditures of monies, and that's a power that is also reserved to Congress to a point. So you are kind of taking some of our other responsibilities away from us and making that judgment for us when we have made that judgment on appropriations. But thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Case. Ms. Roby?
Thank you all very much for being here, and I will go ahead and apologize if my questions are repetitive from previous questions. I'm sorry, I've been taking a lot of meetings in the hallway this afternoon, so just bear with me. But it's my understanding that no funding for family housing projects will be used towards funding the President's declaration of a national emergency. Is that a true statement?
Congresswoman, that is correct.
I just want to reiterate this because it's so important that we continue to provide the best available resources and quality of life for our service members and their families. And it's also my understanding that OSD has not yet come to any of the services to ask for a list of unobligated funds or to assess the risk and impacts to readiness of deferring specific construction projects. Is that also correct?
Congresswoman, just to make sure that I communicate effectively, where we are in the process today is we've begun looking at what those unobligated dollars are across the entire enterprise. We've provided you a gross list that takes us back to fiscal year 2015 of what those unobligated dollars are. In addition, where we are today is beginning to take that list and break it down by project, by state. But any allocation of those against a specific project is premature because the acting secretary is yet to even begin to identify if there are any lists that or any projects that would meet the 2008 authorities.
Well, I would just ask, like my colleague as well, and I think we're all interested that once this request is, the specific request is made, that you will ensure us that you will keep us informed of the priority list and of the unobligated funding.
Our intent is to be fully transparent with that process, Congressman.
Thank you. Lastly, according to DoD information from 2001 to 2014, the department has funded a total of 18 projects under 10 U.S.C. 2808 after the President invoked the National Emergencies Act. And currently, the total number of national emergencies in effect is 32. Is that also a true statement?
Yes, Congresswoman.
So by law, and it is evident by the 32 national emergency declarations currently in place, the President has the authority to reallocate funds through the declaration of a national emergency to address a national crisis. And as a member of the Appropriations Committee, I will work with other members on this subcommittee and the full committee and with the White House to ensure that funding is reallocated appropriately and doesn't come at the expense of our military readiness. And I appreciate, again, your time here today and your willingness to answer our questions. I'm sure as we move through this, we'll have additional questions, and I hope that you'll take those at the appropriate time. And with that, Madam Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Roby. Mr. Cartwright?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you for the witnesses being here today. I want to say at the outset, for over 230 years, honoring the power of the purse has been more than a professional courtesy. It's been a bedrock constitutional principle of our republic. And of course, you do recognize, gentlemen, in the ordinary course, this subcommittee and its Senate counterpart have the constitutionally assigned power of the purse for military construction spending. Acknowledged?
Yes, Congressman, I acknowledge that.
And I appreciated the phrase you just used, Secretary. Our intent is to be fully transparent, and I take it you mean that any time you deviate pursuant to whatever authority from appropriations approved spending for military construction, you're going to let us know. Is that correct?
Congressman, our intent would be on this issue to be transparent. There are, without going through the legal requirements of when we do and do not report, I don't want to answer openly on something that I can't, that it's an open-ended question. I apologize if I sound like I'm milly-mouthing, but I don't want to commit to something.
No, I want to help you with that.
I don't have the authority to do so.
It seems to me part of that answer is it's not your call. Is that correct?
I would defer to our comptroller experts on that question when it is necessary and appropriate to be transparent.
And I want to encourage you to use that expression, I don't know. So many people here in Washington are afraid to say that, and it's okay. You can say, I don't know, if you don't. Well, let me ask you this. Will you keep this subcommittee informed regarding what you're going to do, when you're going to do it, and how you're going to do it? Or do you have to check with somebody?
I can commit to you, sir, that we will keep you informed on this issue with regards to 2808 authorities, where we are in the process and what comes next.
Do you have a schedule for keeping us informed?
I do not, sir, because we haven't yet determined whether or not there will be any 2808 authorities even required, because, as I indicated earlier, the first step in that is waiting for DHS to provide us a list. The assessment goes on from there, and so any schedule I gave you would be dependent upon factors not necessarily within our control.
All right. Answer me this. If there's a lot of litigation that has already been filed by various parties over this whole thing, if a federal court were to enter an order suspending 2808 authority or enjoining this plan in any way, can you tell us that you would obey that court order?
Clearly what I would do is look at our legal counsel to provide assistance in what actions we would take from there.
Very good. Now, when you make decisions on what projects to delay or defer, will those decisions be based on a set of criteria? I think you said they will be.
Yes, Congressman, the criteria is part of the record.
All right. And we've heard that the administration also plans to use $2.5 billion or so in counter-drug funds to pay for border wall construction. I also understand from media reports that the counter-drug account is nearly depleted and that reprogramming of other funds would be necessary first to raise the proposed funds internally before they can be used. I want to say at the outset, under Article 1 of the Constitution, it is for us to decide how money is spent, and it certainly was not the dream of the Founding Fathers that we would find out through media accounts how the money is to be spent. Nevertheless, the media reports say counter-drug report nearly depleted and the reprogramming of other funds would be necessary. If so, would the department request this reprogramming through the Appropriations Committee as it has done in the past, or will it proceed on its own without congressional approval?
Congressman, it's customary for DOD to share reprogramming documents with the Congress once they're approved by OMB. My understanding is based on Section 8005, sir, that DOD needs OMB's approval, but approval from the Congress is not required by law in a reprogramming in 284.
So it will proceed on its own without congressional approval?
Sir, it's, as I stated, DOD will share the reprogramming with the Congress.
All right, my time is up, and Madam Chair, I yield back.
Can I ask staff to clarify Mr. Cartwright's question, because I think there might be a difference of opinion on the answer.
I think it's committee practice that you're talking about the counter-drug section. That is a defense bill reprogramming action that has to be approved by both the authorizers and appropriators. That has been the standard practice for a number of years.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Cartwright. And Mr. Ryan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, thank you. I see you have Ohio roots. coming from Toledo.
I do, sir.
Yes, sir. You're lucky, because I'm not happy about this hearing, but I will show some Buckeye love while we're in this process. I'm flabbergasted with this whole enterprise. Not only the constitutional issues that have been raised here today and since the National Emergency Declaration was made. When we got on the Appropriations Committee, the chairwoman and I, the first thing they said was there's three types of members of Congress. There's Democrats, there's Republicans, and there's appropriators. And we serve with some pretty long-standing members of this committee who instilled into us the responsibility of being on this committee. And it was tied directly to the Constitution of the United States. It was tied to the founding documents. It was supported by fundamental principles that this country was founded upon. And here we are today with us saying these are the priorities, the Congress, House, Senate, White House. These are the priorities of the country. And regardless of how we feel about the southern border, there are so many emergencies in this country right now that if this becomes the standard, and I will say to my friends on the other side, I can only imagine if President Obama or President Clinton did something anywhere near this, people would be running around this town with their hair on fire. And I'm just offended that it has come to this. I don't mind personal behaviors. I don't mind politics. I don't mind any of that. But when you're getting to the fundamental execution of this government, and we see usurping power of projects that the military has suggested, that we have gone through, past House, Senate, through the appropriations process, signed into law, and here comes the President of the United States saying, I'll take that money right there from Wright Pat Air Force Base or Camp Garfield or Youngstown Air Reserve Station, and I'm going to put it to something that I couldn't convince everybody else. Not to mention that the President and the Republicans had control of the House, Senate, and White House for 2 years. And there was no national emergency then? Did something dramatically change? I don't think. And here we are. And I'm not trying to give you too much guff because you're in the chain of command. But you're here, and you need to take this message back. I'm looking at the $60 million for Wright Pat, and I'm thinking this National Air and Space Intelligence Center, responsible for in-depth all-source analysis on foreign airspace, cyberspace, ballistic missile forces, and we go to these briefings. China's cleaning our clock with 5G. China's building islands in the South China Sea, Belt Road Initiative, Make It in China 2025, bases in Africa. That's an emergency. And I got a big laundry list. And I'm just appalled at what's happened, that the politics are now driving the entire train here. I have a couple questions. First, I want to ask if you can commit to the committee that you won't be back here next year with this same national emergency. Can you commit to us that you won't do that?
Congressman, I cannot commit to you that that's the case.
Well, that's what I'm afraid of. So what the hell are we here for? I mean, what are we here for? Because I don't think anybody in this town is going to think that this president is going to stop with this particular circumstance. I don't think Democrats or Republicans, they may not say it in front of the microphone, but no one thinks he's going to stop here. And that's a problem. This 2808 list, does it add up to $3.6 billion?
Congressman, at this point in time, there is no list because we have not yet validated that there is, in fact, a requirement to utilize 2808 authorities. We're waiting, as I indicated earlier, for the Department of Homeland Security to provide an input to the acting secretary, at which time their request will be analyzed, and then at that point in time, if there are any valid requirements, we would utilize the 2808 authorities at that point in time.
And the $3.6 billion came from, that's the money they want for the wall, and they told you, hey, we need $3.6 billion? Is that how that happened?
The president has identified a requirement for $8.1 billion in this fiscal year. The Congress appropriated $1.4 billion. $600 million of it was available through forfeitures. Up to $2.5 billion was identified utilizing 284, and the math at the end of it identified it. That's where the 3.6.
They said we'll go get it from Milcon.
That's correct, sir.
And I want to ask one quick question, if you can indulge me for a few extra seconds, Madam Chair. If Youngstown Air Reserve Station has $8.8 million for a security issue on their base, and they're currently going out to bid right now, and they're in the process of obligating these funds, do they have any idea they're on your list?
At this point in time, Congressman, every unobligated dollar within the department is in consideration. I would defer that question to my counterpart in the Air Force to figure out what specific guidance, if any, they have given at this point in time.
So you don't know if the Air Force told the local bases, like, hold, don't go out for bid?
I'm unaware
on
that anyone in the Department of Defense has told any of the services to defer or hold at this point in time.
I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Ryan. Before we conclude, I had accidentally cut myself off by a minute, so I will just ask one remaining question, which is in reference to your commentary about reprogramming policy. To your knowledge, has the DoD ever acted on a reprogramming action without the authorizers and appropriators' consent? Because our understanding is in practice that if an authorizer or an appropriator, that a relevant appropriations or authorizing leader says no, then DoD has not reprogrammed the money. Is that correct?
I don't know the answer to that, Congressman.
Okay, well, if you could get the answer to that, because our understanding is that is the case. So, again, I would just urge you to take the message back that you heard today, which I think was across the board, pretty clearly across the board. These funds are not flexible. They were appropriated for specific projects, to say nothing of the fact that in many of our opinion, there is not a national emergency, and that we need to make sure that we are following the law and that we are not jeopardizing military readiness, our national security, or stealing funds that are needed, that you said were needed for our troops. With that, Judge Carter.
I thank you for the extra time, Madam Chairman. And I may be wrong, and you may not be able to answer these two things I want to ask you, but I want to ask you anyway. First, on this issue we're just talking about, it's my understanding that since World War II, that has been the policy of the Defense Department, that Congress will sign off on any of these. Now, and I have no knowledge whether it's ever stopped anything or anything else. I just know it's been the policy since World War II, so that's a long, long time. But I was also told that there was a court case that held they did not, if Congress didn't approve, they could still go forward. I don't know if that's true or not, but I was told there was. So I'm going to raise that. Do either of you have any knowledge of that?
Judge, let us take those two questions for record and make sure that we provide you an accurate answer.
Now, another one that concerns me is I was told that Milcon money can only be spent on DOD property. And I know, I don't know how you would treat federal property. Our border between the United States and Mexico is federal property from San Diego to El Paso. When you get to Texas, it's not federal property. There's no federal land except, in my knowledge, except in the Big Bend along the Rio Grande. And that we gave you, okay? Because how we entered the Union was different from everybody else. We're always different, okay? But no, seriously. So I'm assuming, for the best case scenario, it would be put on Arizona land, which is federal land. But does that federal land have to be deeded or transferred to DOD in order for DOD money to be spent on that, or is it just, it has to be on federal land?
Judge,
You know.
for 2808 authorities, for MILCON under those authorities, there are two qualifiers. First, it has to be federal land, and secondly, it has to be under the jurisdiction of a military department.
So you would have to be responsible for whatever that structure was.
To be able to do military construction on that, the answer is yes, Judge.
Has anybody thought about this?
Yes, sir, that has been part of the conversation. We acknowledge that and understand that.
Okay. Well, then I got the right information. Thank you.
Judge, in our materials in the briefing, it says it is also during this phase that DHS and the Department of Justice will start the process of taking land to turn it over to DOD.
Well, that would be in Texas.
Yeah,
That would be in Texas. Because that's private land.
yeah. So it says it is my understanding that the land that will be taken will be federal, state, and private land. This phase could last several months, and there will be significant litigation, et cetera.
Having done that for a living, it could last over several months.
Yep, I would imagine. Okay, well, this has been illuminating, gentlemen. Thank you very much. We appreciate your service to our nation, and we will make sure to hold you to the transparency to which you committed, and suggest that you take back the admonitions that you heard from the co-equal branch of government before which you've appeared today. So thank you very much. With that, we'll transition to the witnesses for the second panel, which is the civilian leadership from the Pentagon for Installations, Energy, and Environment. With us this afternoon is the Honorable Alex Beehler, Assistant Secretary of the Army for Installations, Energy, and Environment, the Honorable Phyllis L. Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Energy, Installations, and Environment, and the Honorable John Henderson, Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Installations, Environment, and Energy. Yeah, just doing housekeeping. Without objection, as you are making your way to your seats, we will enter your written statements into the record. Welcome to all of you. If you, beginning with Secretary Beehler, assuming you're ready to start, if you can summarize your remarks in 5 minutes, beginning with you, Mr. Secretary Beehler, and your full statement will be entered into the record, as will the rest of yours. Secretary?
Thank you very much, Chairwoman Wasserman Schultz, Ranking Member Carter, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for this opportunity to testify on the readiness of our installations with respect to our military construction program and the President's declaration of a national emergency on the southern border. On February 15, 2019, the President issued Proclamation 9844, declaring a national emergency on the southern border. In that document, he invoked U.S. Code Title 10, Section 2808A, Military Construction, which authorizes the Secretary of Defense to determine whether border barriers are necessary to support the use of the armed services and to redirect unobligated DoD MILCON funding to construct border barriers if required. At present, the Acting Secretary of Defense is considering whether and how to use this authority. On February the 18th, he requested from the Department of Homeland Security a privatized list of proposed border construction projects that would support the use of the armed forces in its efforts to assist Customs and Border Protection in securing the southern border. The Acting Secretary of Defense has not yet made any decisions with respect to using Section 2808 authority. No matter what actions are taken using the emergency authority, the Army's #1 priority continues to be readiness, which is completely aligned with the Secretary of Defense and Secretary of the Army's efforts to build and sustain warfighting capabilities. This priority is also consistent with National Defense Strategy objectives. As power projection platforms, Installations remain foundational readiness concerns for all core Army missions, and we will continue to diligently and prudently carry out our goals of modernizing facilities and ensuring energy and water resilience, all while being good stewards of environmental resources. The Army also is keenly aware of the obligation to provide safe, affordable housing to all men and women in uniform. The lethality of our forces begin in the home, where the safety of soldiers and their families promotes peace of mind and mission focus. Wherever our men and women are, whether deployed or garrisoned, we will work every day to ensure soldiers know their loved ones are safe. Because high-quality housing is a readiness concern essential to our mission, I want to stress the Department will not consider any family housing or barracks projects as funding sources for Section 2808. The care of our soldiers and their families will always be of the utmost importance and will remain a priority. Whatever decision is made, I will take the utmost care that we meet our goal of readiness and will work with my peers to ensure the Army effectively carries out potential commitments while maintaining adequate resources for other mission objectives. As this process develops, I will carry out prescribed actions while also serving as an advocate for our soldiers and our mission. I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you, Secretary Beehler. Secretary Bayer.
Good afternoon, Chairwoman Wasserman Schultz, Ranking Member Carter, and members of this fine committee. Thank you for having us here today. It's an honor to sit before you with my fellow service members. In support of the President's goal to protect our homeland and our national defense strategy, Secretary Spencer has focused the Department of the Navy's effort to restore military readiness and increase lethality by taking care of our people, improving our processes, and creating greater capabilities in every area of the Navy and the Marine Corps fighting force. Secretary Spencer and I are fully dedicated and committed to ensuring all Marines, sailors, and their families live in safe, secure housing that meet or exceed health and safety standards. Our commitment stands firm to support our sailors, Marines, and their families. As a result of the President's National Emergency Declaration made on February the 15th of 2019 this year, the Department of Defense is taking a deliberative decision path that includes decisions by Acting Secretary of Defense, Mr. Shanahan, about whether and how to use Section 2808 authority. Until the Acting Secretary of Defense makes his decision here at the Department of the Navy, I lack any definitive guidance to understand the full potential impacts of what this would play out. As of today, the Department has not asked the Department of Navy to redirect unobligated funds, nor to provide an assessment of the risks and impacts of deferring specific construction projects in the expectation of using the 2808 authorities. In advance of this, we have a few specifics to provide, which is, I'm sure, quite frustrating for you. Should the Department direct the Navy to engage in more deliberative planning, we will carefully assess the potential impacts of deferring any projects on fleet and readiness forces across the globe. Every dollar appropriated for MILCON to the Department is important, and as you are aware, the process of getting a project nominated, competed, and authorized for funding and appropriated is deliberative, extensive, and a very important process. We manage each project that you appropriate very carefully. I want to assure you that we take this very seriously, your role as the appropriators of the taxpayers' dollars to be spent in support of the Navy and the Marine Corps' mission. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Secretary Henderson.
Chairwoman Wasserman Schultz, Ranking Member Carter, and distinguished members of this subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear at this hearing today and represent our airmen. I have submitted my full written statement for the record, which details some of the significant ongoing efforts with Air Force installations in environment and energy. On February 15, 2019, the President declared a national emergency exists at the southern border of the United States that requires the use of armed forces, making available certain emergency authorities, including Section 2808 of Title 10 U.S. Code. If the Acting Secretary of Defense determines that the use of Section 2808 is necessary, the Air Force will work with the Department of Defense to identify MILCON funding that could be deferred in support of the use of armed forces in connection with the national emergency while minimizing any impacts to readiness and lethality of the Air Force. On behalf of our airmen and their families, please accept our sincere thanks for your strong and continued support for our Air Force. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Thank you to all three of you. Secretary Henderson, I just returned with Congressman Dunn and Congressman Lawson from the Florida Panhandle, where I toured the devastation that was wrought by Hurricane Michael. Being a Floridian myself and living in Hurricane Alley, I'm quite familiar with the impact that very strong hurricanes can have. I was living in South Florida when Hurricane Andrew hit, Wilma, Katrina, the list goes on. And the devastation that I witnessed in Mexico Beach, in the surrounding communities, on the base, I've not seen since Andrew, and it took my breath away. 95% of Tyndall Air Force Base was destroyed. And one of the criteria that the Secretary will look at is if a project is up for recapitalization to update, fix, or replace existing facilities. Now, Tyndall falls under this criteria, so my concern is that we could potentially see a delay in the rebuilding of Tyndall. Now, I understand that technically the pool of funds that are eligible under the National Emergencies Act are unobligated funds. However, not all of the likely funding for the rebuilding a modern-day Tyndall Air Force Base is going to come from a supplemental. We know we're going to have to do MILCON, and so given that much of Tyndall will be recapitalized to update, fix, or replace existing facilities, is it possible, or even likely, that this action as a result of the President's emergency declaration and his intention to repeatedly steal funding from projects that Congress either already has appropriated or will be, likely means that Tyndall would be further delayed?
Thank you, Chairwoman. I share your concern with Tyndall Air Force Base and the devastation that's happened there on the base and in the community around it. And we're working in partnership with the folks in the local community and everybody who's assisted us in the recovery of Tyndall Air Force Base. And please be assured that the recovery and reconstruction of Tyndall Air Force Base is an absolute priority for the Air Force, as it is for the administration. And we're committed to getting that done. As we've discussed before, our initial estimates is there's about a $4.7 billion bill to go back and rebuild what is one of our key fighter bases. It's near national treasures for ranges, and it's got very unique airspace that are critical to the support of joint.
If we can stipulate to all that, and you just get to my question, which is there a likelihood or even a possibility that as a result of the President's emergency declaration and the funds that are potentially eligible to be shifted, taken, is it likely or even a possibility that Tyndall's further rebuilding could be delayed?
Ma'am, for 2808 authority, right now we haven't put together the 1391s for the MILCON projects. So right now I don't see that there's no funds there that would be eligible to be removed from our plan at Tyndall.
So it's not possible, is what you're saying? Because there's no funds appropriated now to recapitalize, update, fix, or replace existing facilities?
That's correct.
So there's no possibility that Tyndall's rebuilding will be delayed? as a result of this declaration?
There's probably two pieces of that. First of all the funds that we're currently using at Tyndall are currently being cash flowed out of current Air Force FY19 O&M funds, and we're already pulling those from other accounts because that is a priority for us. And secondly, because of the urgency and because of the mission that we're trying to recover there, it would be highly unlikely that we would divert funds from Tyndall at this point in support of 2808 authorities.
Okay, well, we're going to watch that very closely because the surrounding region where Tyndall is 60% of their economy is dependent on Tyndall coming back up and running and being fully functional. I would like to ask each of you, do you believe a border wall is more important than the projects which each of you and your departments have requested that at the time you deemed vital to our readiness and national security?
Madam Chairman, I support the President and the Acting Secretary of Defense, and whatever decision he may make will engage in the deliberative process that results from it.
Madam Chairwoman, I would say that there's many important things here, and we've got competing priorities. And for the Department of the Navy, we are going to put readiness first, which is consistent with our considerations if asked to contribute to the 2808 authority. And we are making decisions as best as we can, at the time asked.
Okay.
Thank you.
Secretary Bayer, among the unobligated funds projects, those for which money has been set aside but not awarded, are $60 million for an aircraft maintenance hangar at Marine Corps Air Station Cherry Point in North Carolina. The 1391 that accompanied this project stated, and the 1391 is the description of need that you provide to us as a committee. That 1391 that accompanied the project stated that, quote, there are no existing hangars that can support the requirements of the F-35B aircraft, and if this project was not funded, the station, quote, will be unable to support the planned basing of F-35 squadrons. This planning for this project started in September of 2016. So I ask you, what is more important, supporting the military and the bed down of the next generation aircraft or building a border wall? I know there are competing priorities, but this was what you said was critical.
Important. Yes, ma'am. It's a very important project for us. And if asked to make decisions on unobligated balances at that time, we are doing our very best to put readiness first.
How will the loss of this project impact operational readiness at Cherry Point?
I'd have to take that one, ma'am. I'm not that familiar with that level of detail. I'll take that one for the record.
Thank you. I have more questions, but I'm over my time. Yield back to myself and recognize.
Whoops, sorry. Secretary Beehler, Section 2808 authorizes the Secretary of Defense, in the event of a national emergency, to undertake military construction projects without regard to other provisions of law. Generally, this means the Secretary would not be required to comply with National Environmental Protection Act and federal contracting laws. What analysis will the Army undertake to decide whether it should comply with these laws, and under what circumstances can you envision the Army choosing not to comply with them?
Judge, as I understand the law, and I'm not in a capacity as a lawyer with the Department of Defense, and I would ultimately refer to the department's legal counsel. But my understanding is if NEPA or other environmental requirements impair the department's ability to address a national emergency through military construction necessary to support use of the armed services, then the, quote, without regard to, unquote, clause in Section 2808 overrides
the provisions of NEPA or other environmental requirements to the extent that they conflict with the ability of the department to meet the exigencies of the national emergency.
And the words use of the military authorities would probably be a key issue in that, right?
Yes, sir.
Now I'm going to ask a question that's kind of off this subject, but it's all over me and the Air Force, the Army and the Air Force. We've recently announced, y'all are talking about a Tenants' Bill of Rights, both of you, the Army and the Air Force. And it's because in our privatized housing, I would say that we have not dealt well with the maintenance and repair on the existing housing. That may be on the developers. I don't know. Please describe the steps you take to address the concern, and have the Navy and the Marine Corps made a decision on whether they're supporting developing a Tenants' Bill of Rights.
Sir, I'll go first. The services are working together on developing a tenants or residents Bill of Rights. We've been in discussions amongst ourselves as well as shared with the private companies, executives. So they've been brought into the process. Our goal is to be able to announce something publicly within the next few days, but we're still in the drafting stages.
Does that speak for everybody?
That's correct, Judge Carter. We are working together, and we believe that it is an important initiative to set out the expectations of both the partner and the military service members and their families, just to ensure that we don't find ourselves in a situation that we have found ourselves in here recently.
You agree?
Judge, I would confirm that. As a matter of fact, the three of us are meeting tomorrow on this exact topic, and this is about communicating better with the residents to understand.
I guess I'm premature, but thank you very much. And I had a question about estimates of cost for repair of Navy and Marine Corps installations, including Camp Lejeune, but I've got something from the Marine Corps that says they found a bunch of money and they're still working on it. So I'll take that as an answer. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Judge Carter. Mr. Case.
Thank you. Sorry, I don't have any more kid analogies for the afternoon. So, Secretary Beehler, you made the point in your testimony, written and oral, that basically family housing was off the table. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, I happen to agree that family housing is a very high priority, but I want to know how that decision was made, because obviously you talk a great deal here about prioritizations and a process that you've gone through and are going to go through to try to prioritize these projects and, where you're going to have to make the cuts. But some decision was made to take that category off the table. Now, I agree with it, but there was some decisions being made already as to how to prioritize the actual money allocated to the wall. Is that correct? And where was that decision made?
Sir, my only knowledge comes from the fact that was a statement made by the acting Secretary of Defense, and I was not otherwise privy as to how he made that decision.
Okay. I asked this question of Secretary McMahon. Were any of you consulted in advance as to exactly how this would be carried out or what impact it would have on readiness? So was there any advice given from the DOD anywhere that you know of back to the President and to the White House that, hey, this actually might have quite an impact on our military capabilities and our readiness? You've made a very big deal in your testimony on readiness. We agree with you. That's why we appropriated and prioritized these projects. So what consultation occurred in advance?
As I say, sir, I've not been privy to any consultation.
That's right, Congressman. We were provided this guidance from the Office of the Secretary of Defense.
I'm the same way. I don't know of any consultation. I assume that the president's advisors, military advisors that he consulted with, but I'm usually not in that ring.
Okay. I mean, maybe you don't know the answer given your answers, but I mean, was it just like, hey, I'm going to do this emergency declaration and we have to pay for it. Congress hasn't appropriated the money and we are under our 2808 authority. Go out and figure out a way to do it, DOD? Or was there direction given from the White House to the DOD as to how to carry this out? Was there any thought given that you know of to exactly, how this was all going to play out?
Sir, once again, I have no knowledge.
Again, sir, I apologize. I can't provide you a better answer to your question, but this was the guidance that we were provided, and I was not part of those conversations.
I have nothing to add.
Okay. And then I'm trying to sort this out. A lot of this has to do with the testimony, the prior testimony. You're going through a kind of a matrix, if I can think about this in my own mind, of a process of analyzing if, in fact, you have to get into these funds at all. Which one are you going to pick out? And I heard a couple of different factors. The first I heard was a basic one of, how's it going to impact our readiness? You've taken family housing off the table, so we're talking about non-family housing. So one category is readiness. Another category, it would seem to me, is that some of these projects are a midstream, right? Because they're multi-year projects, right? So you've got, projects that haven't started yet, or as you call them, obligated yet, versus projects that are kind of happening along the way. Maybe they're longer-term projects. I think you also have, if I'm thinking this through a little bit, an ingredient where there are already negotiations going on with bidders. There's already a bid process in place. No formal obligation yet, but there are bidders out there. They're spending money. They're spending time. They have an entire expectation that they're going to be able to get a bid if they have the low bid, versus people that have not even started that process yet. Have you thought? It sounds like a mess, frankly. I mean, you've got a lot of factors to consider in apparently a very short period of time. Is that the case for actually how you pull this off?
Once the acting secretary makes the decision, sir, we have to move. We recognize we have to move very quickly. The Army is attempting its own internal sort of category categorization, and is the staff in the Army is working on that. It's a work in progress.
Thank you. I'm sorry, my time is up, so I better just conclude there. I would just say that the concern by my colleague, Mr. Ryan, I think is a real one, which is if you have people out there in the middle of a bid process, no formal obligation yet, and you're going to pull a plug out from underneath them, I think you owe them some notice right now.
Mr. Rutherford? Thank you, Mr. Case.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Henderson, I want to follow up on the chairwoman's earlier line of questioning about Tyndall Air Force Base. You mentioned in response to one of her questions that there actually are no funds available for 2808 at Tyndall, and you said that's because you were pulling other funds from other areas for the rebuilding of Tyndall Air Force Base. Is that correct?
That's correct. Operations and maintenance funds.
Okay. So can operations and maintenance funds, can you give the committee a list of where those are coming from as a report? I'm curious what those where those funds are coming from and in what amounts.
So to date, we've spent about $350 million in operations and maintenance funds at Tyndall. Those funds primarily are coming out of facilities accounts in the Air Force, other facilities accounts. So in other words, funding that would have been primarily scheduled to be spent at the end of the year. We've pulled those forward in the beginning of the year. We've surged those in on Tyndall on the
Mr. Secretary, I don't want to cut you short, but I didn't expect you to have the whole list here today.
Okay. No, it's fine.
But if you could just provide something in writing on that, I would like to see where those dollars are coming from and what amounts they are, because I didn't know those shifts were taking place. Also, I presume that there will be a request coming in the 2020 budget for substantial rebuilding of Tyndall, correct?
That's our plan.
Okay, and following back up on the question as well about how the decisions are being made, I have information from it says that DOD will look to funds from projects in the following order. Projects that have not been awarded, are recapitalization projects, are awarded later in the fiscal year, and have minimal operational readiness risk, which I've heard earlier. But I hadn't heard these others before. Is that a correct category of decision making?
I'm sorry, which others?
They are projects that have not been awarded.
Yeah. Okay.
They are part of a recapitalization project.
Yep, I understand. That was part of Mr. McMahon's written statement, the criteria that he'd put in there.
Yeah,
that's the general guidance and considerations with regard to how we might consider projects. Each of the services, though, from I'll speak for the Air Force only in this case. Each of the services, we're going to do that look to make sure that we're minimizing any impacts to readiness through that process.
Okay.
And in the general criteria that he's put out is essentially a good method for us, a good framework for us to use, but not every project fits that. There might be some red lines. There might be some stuff that we're in the point of the acquisition process that even though the funds aren't obligated, that we would never do anything that didn't make sense along those lines. So,
okay.
So we're going to support the request of the Secretary of Defense to the best of our ability while minimizing impacts to readiness.
Okay.
And sometimes we don't exactly go by criteria.
Okay. And finally on Tyndall, I know there's currently an EIS underway for Tyndall's MQ-9 wing. Are you planning on running an EIS for the new F-35 squadron in parallel with that?
We're required to by law, sir. Absolutely.
Oh, okay. Okay. Thank you. And Ms. Beer, I know naval and don't have much time left, but naval installations are considering the impact of sea level rise. This is a little off the topic here, but I'm curious. Can you give me just a thumbnail sketch of the Navy's strategic plan for how to address sea level rise?
I can, sir. It has been brought to the Navy and the Marine Corps' attention that we are dealing with some flooding and extreme weather and sea level rise. Our engineers, the Naval Facility Engineering Command, prepared a handbook for adaptations as we plan and design our facilities to include, like, say, piers and buildings, where we site those facilities. And we're carefully taking into consideration any way that the design would need to be modified or adapted so that it would be more resilient and could withstand the effects of sea level rise, for example.
So are individual installations doing these studies on their own, or is there...
No, sir. It's more part of our master planning, and it's
Okay.
incorporated into that bigger process so that we're thinking about it from the very beginning in a more holistic approach.
Okay. Thank you very much. My time is up. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rutherford. I think I'm the only one with remaining with questions, and I just have a couple. Mr. Henderson, I think I just heard you say, I know that with the O&M money that is being shifted for Tyndall, that means you're taking it away from other places that it would have been spent, and the expectation or hope is that Congress would essentially pay that back by appropriating the replacement funds, which would often be done in an emergency supplemental. But I've just heard you say that this is the replacement funding for Tyndall is going to come out of the hide of the Air Force in the FY20 budget request. Does that mean there's not going to be an emergency supplemental appropriations request coming from the administration to address Hurricane Michael and other disasters?
So I don't want to speak for the administration on what their plans are with regard to submitting a disaster supplemental, not just for Hurricane Michael, but for all the other disasters that have been out there. I can speak to, as we discussed earlier, since the recovery of Tyndall is a priority, we've been cash flowing that with facilities funds, with operations and maintenance funds that are under our supervision to get that done on the auspices that in some way, shape, or form we will have to make up for those FY19 funds. Some of that may be out of HIDE or maybe out of other Air Force programs, and then if there's not a supplemental funding, a disaster supplemental, then we have no other option really than to go back and ask for next year's FY20 requirements for Tyndall recovery in the FY20 budget. And in that time, we probably have the 1391s can start talking about some of the MILCON requirements there too.
So how does, if that is what happens, and there's no supplemental, and you have to come out of your own hide, your own MILCON hide in FY20, how does that not nearly completely consume your MILCON requests for FY20?
That's a great question. It's a complex problem, and so what we've done is we've identified the requirements. We're going through that process right now, identifying the base as it should be built back to support fifth generation fighters. We're submitting those funding requirements to OSD, and we're going to work with them, and we'll work with Congress on the resources to get the resources available to fully recover Tyndall Air Force Base.
So basically the answer to my first question of you is yes, because, I mean, given that we have to repay the money that you're spending now, that we have FY19 projects that are likely going to be taken, that ultimately will delay funding for true emergencies like rebuilding Tyndall. Seems no question about that, especially if there's no emergency. I mean, right now, Tyndall is counting, that region is counting on an emergency supplemental, and it's not like there aren't other needs that the Air Force has. So if all of this ends up getting top-loaded in FY20, then you are going to either impact how quickly we rebuild Tyndall or dramatically impact the rest of your MILCON priorities, which affects readiness. So doesn't that mean that this national emergency declaration by the President is going to affect military readiness?
So what we're talking about here is a whole host of national security priorities for which there aren't enough resources to go around. And I see and speak for the Air Force national security priorities, but I don't speak for how we adjudicate resources for the overall national security priorities. Right. And being a part of the Air Force, we've always
Air Force readiness. Then won't it impact Air Force readiness, given everything that we've just discussed?
Yes, ma'am. And my charge is to ensure that we're supporting those national security priorities in a way that minimizes impacts to Air Force readiness. In other words, getting our mission done as we've always done, given the resources that we have.
I'll just note that I know you're doing your job and that you didn't say no. So by the fact that you didn't say no, essentially, you're saying yes.
I would say that the fair answer is I don't know. This is authority that hasn't been invoked yet. We haven't gone through the readiness impacts. With regard to the readiness at Tyndall, there's one appropriated MILCON project that's there right now for a fire station, and then to even speak to whether that any funding from that would be deferred, that would be that would be something that we put into the process, even if it was even invoked in the first place.
Tyndall needs $4 billion, and if there's no supplemental, and we take all of that out of your hide in FY20, and we have to repay the O&M money that you're spending now, and you cancel FY19 projects, in the Air Force projects that you previously asked for and said were essential. How does that not affect Air Force military readiness?
Right. So we've submitted those requirements to DOD on the auspices that there may be other resources within the government that could be reprogrammed to put towards disaster recovery.
Not sure what that means, but I think we've made our point.
I think our point here is the Air Force cannot afford to recover Tyndall inside of our currently planned and programmed appropriations, and I think I have to leave the committee with that. And we're doing everything we can to keep that recovery on track and to maintain the readiness and lethality and our readiness objectives for the Air Force in FY19, and then taking a look at that in the fight up, and we're doing the best we can with that.
So please urge the White House to request an emergency supplemental, because it doesn't make sense to me that you can not affect military readiness if you don't have one. Thank you. I want to thank the indulgence of the committee today, thank our witnesses, and in conclusion, we really are facing some very significant challenges here as presented by the President's emergency declaration. We are concluding here this afternoon. I want to remind members that our next hearing is tomorrow, February 28th at 10 a.m. in HT2 in the Capitol. And the topic will be female veterans' access to the VA. Thank you. The committee stands adjourned.